You are listening or watching, if you're on YouTube, YouTube. How about that? You don't do YouTube. Maybe you go.
Is that are you wearing your Pumas and watching the YouTubes?
I'm thinking about some finances right now, Sam. So just, leave me alone. How you
Finances or finances?
Yeah, finances. If you're watching this or if you're listening to this, we have a lot of interesting conversations between recordings, Amy, Sam, and I, and sometimes somebody else.
Interesting is a vague and oblique word that allows the listener or the reader to insert their own meaning.
That's what I was about to say. You're just putting words in my mouth, or you're taking words from my mouth and putting them in your mouth.
We might.
You want to talk so much, I can't even finish my sentences because you're doing that. Okay, that's what interesting is. And we're going to be talking about the life cycle of a pastor. And what is a life cycle? A life cycle are the phases that a pastor goes through at a singular church. And we'll be talking about that. But I was thinking, I know we call him Vanderbloom and Onion from time to time, but I was thinking about Vanderbloom and the search group, and he and William Vanderbloom and I were in a conversation recently, and he was talking about how different things are really, really post-quarantine, post-pandemic, and how it's affecting his organization and how well they're doing. I wonder, and by the way, we can put a link to Vanderbloom, and I mean, you want a great search organization, or even an organization that can help you in some type of transition or succession. But we'll put the link there. But my point in all of this is things have changed. And Sam, what we're going to be talking about in the life cycle of a pastor, the years have been compressed from what they used to be. So
I think so. And we're going through a great reshuffling, which we've talked about on previous episodes as well. So there's a lot going on here. We'll just say that.
There is. There's so much that's packed into these 5 life cycle points, but we'll get to them. Hey, before we do that, I want to thank Southeastern Seminary. We love Southeastern Seminary. We love our friends at Southeastern. We love Danny Aiken, the president. We often talk about Chuck Lawless and other friends that we have out at Southeastern. Understand this: if you go to Southeastern, you're going to get a great theological education. Whether you are getting it online or you go on campus at Wake Forest, you're going to get a great theological education, but you're also going to get great ministry preparation. And I can just assure you, I have a son who is a graduate of Southeastern. I have another son who was a executive at Southeastern. And I'm just going to tell you, it is a great place.
I went to Southeastern. Don't leave me out.
You went to Southeastern?
Yes. I got my PhD from Dallas Baptist University, but they allowed me to do my concentration through some courses at Southeastern.
Well, I didn't mean to leave you out. So you are an alum. You're not a grad, but you're an alum.
Correct.
Of Southeastern. So all 3 boys have had a connection to Southeastern. We're proud of it. Well, anyway, go look at scbts.edu. And if you happen to apply, which we hope you will, when you apply, use this code, Church Answers, one word, no space, answers is plural. Let's go to the life cycle of a pastor. Pastors typically go through 5 major tenure stages at a church. We're going to look at 5 of these. Let's talk about this first one, Sam. Honeymoon. And this used to be years 0 to 2. Now it's 0 to 1. I can say experientially, mine was 0 to 1, but it's usually 1 month. But what?
Yeah, you can do some things.
Talk about the honeymoon period. What's going on during that time?
Everybody's learning each other. So here's something that most people don't realize. When you go to a church, and this applies to any pastor, whether you're a veteran or new or whatever, you're new at the church. Everyone is projecting on you things. They don't know you. They barely know anything about you. So they are thinking that you're somebody else. They've got in their mind some of their favorite aspects of a pastor, or maybe
you have been idealized in their mind, and at some point,
or villainized.
Well, okay, villainized it.
Some people do that. They think the worst of you right at the beginning. But
Sure.
the vast majority of people will idealize who they think you are. And guess what? You're going to disappoint everyone because
Yep.
you're not who they think you are. Because you're your own person. You're not the figment of their imagination.
All right. Before we get to that, you're no longer the ideal person. What's going on during the honeymoon, though? What is?
Yeah, all of those idealized things people are projecting on you, and they think the world of you because they think month 1, month 2, month 3, you are the ideal pastor.
And typically, the exiting pastor was the less than ideal, even if he was well loved. And what they're doing now is saying, this pastor is doing this, and the predecessor pastor didn't. Isn't that wonderful?
Yes.
Until you start
It's
doing some
wonderful
things.
until it's not.
Until it's not. Exactly. I'm trying to keep us in the honeymoon phase, though. You're exiting us out of it pretty daggum quickly.
Well,
So
because it does feel like it happens quickly. I mean, you're getting to know everybody, things are going well, and then boom, it just hits. It typically is like you can probably point to like a business meeting or a moment or a service or like this month or this week. It's not like you phase out of the honeymoon. Typically, you it just comes to a grinding halt.
let me tell you what's been typical in my old age experience of going back to churches. Mine has been losing the favor of a singular individual who is influential in the church. I
Yeah,
can think of that in 3 of the 4 churches where I was pastor.
yeah, a gatekeeper that
Yep.
once they say the word, this is bad. This pastor's not doing what we wanted him or her to do. It gets haywire.
So that leads us to the trials and crisis, years 1 to 3. These are not magical markers. They're not necessarily the best markers, but they're pretty common. And what is common about the trial and crisis part of the life cycle of a pastor is this is where a pastor usually leaves. This
Yeah.
is the most common place where a pastor says, this is not worth it. In some cases, the pastor's forced out during this period by the group that says he's not meeting this standards, or in other cases, the pastor said it's not worth it.
Yeah. And this crisis can hit very hard. I mean, it can be intense. And it can be intense over even silly things, as from a leader's perspective, like why are they fighting over this? Why, but the people are, and you're in the center of it, and you're everybody's target because you're the one in leadership. And we see this, Dad, with football coaches,
Mm-hmm.
in any sport, but especially I'd say especially football, where at the college level or the pro level, like you don't perform in a couple of years, you're out. Like you're
No, it's not called
maligned.
you've been Urban Meyered out. Is in the NFL. You don't. He didn't last. He didn't last the season.
Yeah,
It just
there may have been some reasons for that. I don't know. I don't follow the NFL all that much, but I'm a baseball guy. But the principle remains. I think and executives can experience this as well. Couple quarters in, if you're not producing, you're out. So there are some professions where this happens more, and I would say being a pastor is one of those.
yes.
That people are looking for immediate results, and when you don't produce, and you can't, that's the thing. It's in most churches, you don't have the power to make all the decisions. Very rare does a pastor have that kind of power. So it's like you don't even have the ability to move that quickly. And churches don't want you to move that quickly, except that they're wanting results that quickly. And when that occurs, yeah, you can find yourself in some heat.
Trial and crisis period often takes place when the pastor has begun to make some decisions, and it is contrary to that idealized leadership pastor that others thought. And so you feel like you're in a bind sometime. If I make a decision, I'm going to get into this trial and crisis era, even though you may not articulate it that way. But if I don't make a decision, I'm going to be in some kind of crisis because I'm not
Right.
leading. I'm not moving forward.
And this can happen. Trial and crisis can happen even when you are wildly successful. And that occurs through what we call the berry bucket principle. We didn't name that. Somebody else did many, many years ago, probably 40 or 50 years ago at this point. And it's where you have enough new people that the older folks, or that they might be older in age, but the people that were there before you feel like they're losing power. So everyone loves growth. I mean, the whole church loves it when things start growing, right? Until they feel like their voice is not the one that's being heard, and all these new people are getting the attention.
Typically illustrated by something changing in the church that is more of the decision of the new berries instead of the old berries. Now, you talked about the berry bucket. I want to give a little bit of caveat explanation. Berry bucket, that term, I absolutely love. It was started by Carl George, and he gives a little bit of an explanation of why he did that and why it was in his context. But it's a bucket that has berries in it. Okay, and when Sam becomes pastor, day one, there are no berries in one bucket because that bucket represents all the people who came after the new pastor. So there are no berries in that bucket. The other bucket is full because it represents everybody who was there before the pastor. Well, what happens? One bucket is only going to get lighter, fewer berries in it because people will die, people will move out, people will get mad, they'll leave, whatever reason. One bucket, which is called the former berries or the old berries, is going to get lighter. Usually, the only thing that's going to happen to the other bucket is going to get heavier. And so, if you imagine that these buckets are on some type of fulcrum and they're beginning to, you had the old berries outweighing the new berries, and then they start getting closer to balance, that's when the crisis really occurs because not just losing power, but we're losing our church the way it was.
So, what we're telling you is whether you were successful or not, you're going to have a trial and a crisis, even if you do exactly what everyone wants you to do and the church grows. You're still probably going to enter into a season of trial and crisis.
That's why I try to tell younger pastors, be ready for this. Don't be cynical, but be prepared. It is going to happen.
Yeah. And just, again, reminding people, these timelines are a little different now. I mean, it can happen earlier. It can happen later. COVID, I was talking to a pastor who, he's like, he told me, he said, man, I'm in year 5 and I feel like it's worse than it's ever been.
That's
And
COVID. Yeah.
And I should, he says, I've listened to you guys talk. He told me this. This was actually on Sunday. I was talking to him and he goes, I feel like I should be entering into that season where things are getting better. And I said, dude, you've had 2 years of COVID.
That almost breaks the cycle. You got to do something.
It said you're still in the trial and the crisis, unfortunately. And some of our listeners may be going, man, I'm in year 5. I'm in year 6. Why hasn't it gotten better? Well, you had
because you're in year 3 or 4.
Yeah, because COVID kind of made things wonky with this timeline. So just keep that in mind. This is a well-researched life cycle, but with where we are now in the life of the church, with everything we've experienced the last 2 years, it may be out of sync just a little bit.
And I think just saying 2 years probably cut out was a good way of looking at it. The third part of the life cycle is realignment. That has a lot of implications to it. It means that the church is beginning to adjust to this pastor, adjust to the leadership, or the realignment could mean they're going further apart. And as a result, there's about to be some type of parting of the ways. But this is where clarity begins to develop. The pastor is going a particular way. Is the congregation going to follow?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is where most pastors come to the realization of, is this where I'm going to stick it out for a little longer? Or is this where I'm going to transition out? That can happen
This is the second most common period to leave. The first most common is a trial and crisis. The second most common.
Yeah, and I'll say this as a pastor who, maybe even of my own doings, had pastored a few churches and had some trials and crises at each one, and it has entered into realignment and now in growth mode at West Bradenton. I'm in year 7. I'm about to hit my 7-year anniversary, and
unbelievable.
It's yeah, I know, it's wonderful. I feel very blessed. I mean, I just feel the church is in a good place, and that's not the purpose of this episode, but I just feel very blessed as a pastor now. And I was talking to some of my buddies. I'm like, I almost feel guilty. Like, I'm so used to crisis. I'm so used to like COVID and crisis and trial and all this stuff that And then I was like,
And you had and the pre-COVID crises you had too.
I had plenty. And again, some of it may have been my own doings, um, it's like, well, we're in a good spot. And there's almost that tenseness within me where I'm like, what's coming? What's lurking around the corner? And it's nothing. And it is a really good place to be. Now I just got to make sure I don't do something to enter into trialing and fall back
Uh,
into trial and crisis.
I think you're doing well. So after the realignment comes what typically are the most fruitful years of the pastor's ministry. Typically, always exceptions. And as people hear this, they'll say, not me, and take into consideration you may have had 2 years ripped from your life cycle calendar because of COVID, but it's the growth. It is what you are in right now, Sam. Even with the 2 years ripped from COVID, you're in year 7. So take those 2 away, and you're about to enter year 5, whichever way you want to look at it. This is where the church and the pastor, it's the church is beginning to look like the pastor's beginning to look like the church. And this is some of the healthiest time.
Frankly, this is where people start calling you pastor. Like I hear more
That's a
Pastor
great
Sam.
point.
I've people say Pastor Sam now, and I don't ask them to. They can call me whatever. It doesn't bother me. Call me Sam, but they do it naturally, and this is where it occurs. So if you're demanding, like, call me Pastor so and so, the honeymoon people do it, but if you're demanding that during trials and crisis, you're not the pastor yet. I mean, that we've heard that advice from some old timers, right? You don't get to be the pastor until year 5, year 6, year 7. And the spirit of what they're saying is true. It's very true. You have to earn that trust. And it takes time in most established churches.
This last phase, I'm calling the mystery phase. And there's several reasons behind it. One, we don't have enough data. There are just not enough pastors who make it to year 12 and beyond. Secondly, there are 2 groups of pastors this year, even though the pool is very small relative to the other periods. One is the pastor who's just hanging on and won't let go, but needs to let go. And the other one is a pastor who seems like maybe they have a second or third life and they're starting afresh. I don't have enough information to say this is definitively the best era. I can just simply say growth years 5 to 12 tend to be the best, and it remains to be seen. And now with COVID, gosh, Sam, we've seen so many long tenured pastors surprisingly say it's time to retire, time to resign.
Well, and this mystery also is a generational thing. So boomers are what was the largest generation. They're retiring, and some of them are unfortunately died passing. And we're getting to that stage where what is going to happen next? All these boomer pastors are retiring, and they're just demographically, there's just simply not enough younger, 30 and 40 somethings to replace them. So this is a big mystery right now. We just don't know what's going to happen with tenure and where churches are going to be with somebody who sticks it out 12, 15, 20 years. It's a big unknown right now.
I will not necessarily pick on my generation, but I will say this about many in my generation, the boomer generation. That's the 76 million people born between 1946 and 1964. I will say this: many in my generation are having trouble adjusting to the new realities of post-COVID. They said, I don't know how to lead in this era. I had a good idea of what church was like or how to do church. I would do air quotes, or maybe I can for the YouTubers out there. Uh, I I don't know this new era. I don't know how to lead a church. I thought I had it all down, and now it's a mystery to me, and I don't think I can keep on doing this. I'm hearing that from my generation, at least many in my generation, Sam. Not all of my generation is old in mind and spirit, but some of them are, and they don't know how to adjust.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly a major issue, and I say this in all love, and I say it with all respect, because there's plenty of pastors who have led well for 30, 40, 50 years, and the world changed, and it changed very quickly. And I think that this is something that it's not only pastors, it's every vocation. And it's this struggle to know how do I lead now? And yeah, I would call this a mystery. And there's going to be some that figure it out and some that just don't. But I do remain optimistic about the church, but we have to be realistic in that there isn't a lot of younger people to replace those who are
Uh,
inevitably going to retire.
you've got Gen X and older millennials, next in line, and there are not as many of them as there were boomer pastors for sure.
Well, demographically, yeah, Gen X is just a small generation, and I know many of our Gen Xers will probably amen me on this. They don't get mentioned enough.
Yeah.
There's a lot
Oh,
of great Gen X
we
pastors that
love
are
you,
out
Gen
there.
X. Glad to have you, Gen Xers. I know we are very fond of you, Gen Xers.
Everyone talks about boomers. Everyone talks about millennials because they're the two largest generations. But those Gen Xers, they just don't get mentioned enough. But because they are a smaller group, demographically, it's just not as many to take the roles. I mean, there's just a smaller number of them. But it will impact pastor tenure because that means more shuffling, not less. When there is a limited supply of those who are whatever position, there tends to be more movement because there's actually more upward mobility, but that leaves a lot of churches hanging. And so we're going to see this life cycle change quite a bit in terms of who's going to get to certain stages. A lot of people are going to leave right before the growth years because there's another church that's a quote unquote better opportunity for them, just because there's the limited supply of pastors.
That is so true. Hey, I'm just thinking about our podcast and our team for this podcast. We've got Amy, who is the older part of Gen X. Am I saying that right, Amy? Yes.
She's
You
right
are
on the line. She's on the Gen X line, and I'm on the millennial line.
you're on the millennial.
We share that line.
I'm right in the middle of the boomers, 46, 64. I'm born in 1955. Then we have Akeem, who's 5 to 6 years older than I am, 6 years older than I am. So he is on the older side of the boomers. So we've got all kind of representation here. But between Akeem and me, we have two boomers. Thank you, my friend Akeem. Yes, sir.
I am glad you can share the boomer with him. That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
You know, I've shared a lot with my friend. So, Sam, I think this is a good overview of the life cycle of a pastor. We could say a lot more. We might come back and say a lot more in the future, but we'll end it for now, and we'll let you end it with a word of thanks for our wonderful sponsor.
Yeah, I want to thank Tyndale and the NLT Streetlights New Testament. This is a visually compelling, easy to understand resource for churches, ministries, and individuals. The NLT Streetlights New Testament explains Christian truth to young people and serves as a basic discipleship tool for ministries. Its unique tone and approach to the gospel have a strong appeal to those in an urban culture. So go check out the NLT Streetlights New Testament. You can see the link in our show notes. I really like this because it's got QR codes in it. They've got some neat content, way to focus the content to answer some key questions about like, who is God? Who am I? What do I do? So you should go check it out. Streetlights New Testament show notes. And also want to thank all of you who listen and watch on the YouTubes, as my father says. And for those who didn't know the Puma joke at the beginning, you called your Puma shoes Pumas for the longest time, and it's like when you have a little kid and they say something funny and you don't want to correct them, and no one really wanted to correct you because it was so cute that you called the Pumas. But anyway.
I get it, Sam. You want to finish?
Yeah, I did. I just want to poke back a little bit. Thank you again for joining us on Rainer on Leadership. Be sure to watch on YouTube, subscribe on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Join us online at churchanswers.com, where we are growing healthy churches together.